Hi, I'm Kim Rubenstein. I'm a professor of law at the University of Canberra, and I started teaching constitutional law in 1993.
And hi, I'm James Blackwell. I'm a Wiradjuri man and research fellow at the ANU and member of the Uluru Dialogue at UNSW.
This year is such an important year for the Australian Constitution because we're being asked to change it. Now, if you want to change something, you really have to know what it is that you're changing. So this podcast series is to introduce you to the Australian Constitution, all aspects of it, to help you when you make your decision about this referendum.
So join us for this 8-part series as we explore the Constitution, the law, the vibe of the thing, and Indigenous issues in this really important referendum year.
And indeed, it's not just the vibe, it's the Constitution.
In summing up, it's the Constitution, it's Mabo, it's justice, it's law, it's the vibe, and no, that's it, it's the vibe.
That was sensational.
So welcome, James. We're back here talking about federalism. And as we discussed in our opening session, one of the key aspects of us becoming a Commonwealth was that each of the different colonies at the time were becoming frustrated about different aspects of governing for the entire geographic region, and so there was a real move towards federation.
It makes me long for the days when the whole continent was New South Wales and no state of origin because there is no Queensland. No, I'm being facetious, but yeah.
That does lead into the fact that whilst they were wanting to come together as a single nation, there was fierce rivalry and differences that they felt, and differences that to this very day that you're expressing in terms of the ways in which individuals around the country do identify as being linked to a state. So the fact that I was born in and grew up in Victoria has had an influence on my football following and various other aspects of my identity.
In the same way that as a Sydney-born boy, you saying you're from Victoria makes me immediately judge you because you're from Victoria. Yeah. And I'm not morally allowed to like Victoria. Apologies to all the Victorians listening. But this kind of idea of even with that kind of fake, and I say fake in a general sense, boundaries that Australia has, the borders aren't necessarily meaningful in any way, aside from perhaps the Murray River, which is a natural border,
yes,
and Tasmania, which of course has a very kind of convenient way of bordering itself. But in terms of the others, the borders are quite fake. So this idea that we have this longing, and I think for a lot of non-Indigenous Australians have this longing to their state of origin, as evidenced by the football.
Yes.
And even as an Indigenous person, I strongly identify with the Blues and with my state of origin, even though I also have my own Wiradjuri country and connections there. It's this weird thing where we have these fake boundaries, these fake kind of drawn, very straight lines. Australia has this kind of thing where most of our borders, bar a couple instances, are quite straight.
Yes.
Just like with rulers.
Yes, indeed.
And yet they've created this sense of competitive identity where people from WA, especially during COVID, we also had how WA got with their own state identity and Mark McGowan and the state border. But these things do have meaning, even if they're kind of very artificial and very recent.
Yes, and in fact, we'll come back to some of those COVID examples later, I think, because they did highlight some of the problems with our current federal system. But I was also going to ask you, in terms of the different Indigenous nations around the country, they also, I would imagine, cross those borders. Are there aspects or
multiple? I mean, there's multiple examples where these, again, because the borders are so straight and so kind of clearly defined, they often do cut through country. I mean, especially, if you look at WA, the NT, South Australia, Queensland, those borders are relatively straight.
Yeah.
And they do cut across a lot of country. I mean, the Victoria-NSW border, it being a large natural feature, the Murray River is quite large.
Yes.
It does form more of a border between Indigenous countries.
Yes.
Wiradjuri on one side, Yorta on the other. Not saying that the peoples didn't intermingle and come across the river, but that's much more of a natural feature than if you go if you're crossing into South Australia from Victoria, it's just a straight line. Like, there is no natural landmass, which is of course how we identified our country. When landscapes would change, or rivers, or lakes, or mountains, or hills, that would define our country for us.
Yeah,
like the land itself tells us where our borders are, not this kind of very colonial.
Structure.
I mean, you see in Africa as well. Ethnic groups getting carved up by the borders. South America is the same.
Yep.
I think Europe's the exception where the borders kind of group people together. But even in Europe, you have places like the Yugoslavia where the borders don't match the cultural values. But yet, in Australia, this idea of borders is very fake in that kind of sense in terms of culture and identity, but also it's become very real.
And it became pretty fundamental to the drafting, really, of the Constitution in a variety of ways. One, as we said, the impetus, but also in terms of what was felt to be the proper balance between Commonwealth power and state power. And not only that, but also between the states, them continuing to have an equal influence over the overall decision-making of the country. And I guess we see that most strongly in terms of the difference between the House of Reps and the Senate being set up as a state's house. So, for instance, right from the beginning, each of the different states had equal numbers of senators in the Commonwealth Parliament. And we sitting here in the ACT at the moment are very conscious of that because the numbers of people in the ACT, which was not a state but was part of New South Wales, of course, at the time. But
of course, we should disclose that you did run for Senate in 2022.
Yes, I did.
On changing that idea.
Yes, you're getting in ahead of me. Yeah.
On decoupling the number from kind of where it is now at 2 to a much higher number. And
indeed.
Fingers crossed we do see that eventually. I mean, I am not an ACT resident anymore. I now live back in New South Wales, where I proudly have my 12 senators again, which feels, But again, 12 senators for New South Wales is quite a high number of people per senator, but 12 senators for Tasmania, much lower number of people per senator. And you do see the kind of difference, I think.
Yes.
So, people may see it best perhaps with, Jackie Lambie, the independent senator from Tasmania, or Brian Harrity, and also from Tasmania.
Historically,
historically, who passed away a couple of years ago now. That these independent senators, I think, have a better traction perhaps in smaller states where you can easier get a quota than in New South Wales, where you have to get multiple millions of people perhaps to vote for you to become a senator. So it's much more of a major parties thing, but you do see this kind of equality of states create inequality of outcome in a sense.
And that all flows from this idea that in creating the nation, each of the states should have equal influence, and that's being played out in the Senate. So and interestingly, as you said, there are now 12 senators, but it started off at the time of Federation with 6 senators. And then over time there has been a nexus between the House of Reps and the Senate for the states, interestingly not for the ACT. And it was only in 1975 that the ACT and the Northern Territory, under the power that the federal government has over territories, introduced territory representation in the Senate.
And of course, there is a proposal currently before the Parliament. There's a parliamentary committee that's hearing right now about whether both the number overall should be increased from 12, and separately whether the ACT and the NT should get
some more
3 or 6 or 4 or however many that might be.
Yeah.
So potentially that number could change sometime in the next couple of years if the Parliament decides it wants to change. But that's, of course, entirely at the discretion of the senators themselves.
That's right.
Which retrenches that very state power because the Senate itself has to vote on increasing their own numbers, which I think it gets back to that point that we started with, which retrenches the power of the states. Even in the Commonwealth institutions, the states themselves have very strong powers.
That's right. So that's one expression. The Senate, for people to walk away with, is the state's house, although as you've alluded to, over the years it's become more a party house, and different memberships of the Senate have influenced the outcomes of a lot of legislation, because often the government of the day doesn't necessarily have a majority in the Senate. So we see power playing out differently. But it still was set up, and it's an expression of a federal system that you have, and we mirror it again, the American Constitution, as we explained earlier. The American Constitution influenced that. The states continued to be able to be treated equally through the Senate.
And at the time of the constitutional drafting, the US didn't have Senate elections. US senators at the time of our constitution's drafting were appointed by their state parliaments.
So
it was only in the early 20th century that the US people, American people, were allowed to vote for senators. Up until as recently as 100 and something years ago, they were very, very cemented as a state house in America, at least, because state legislatures were the ones who would appoint senators to those seats. So
you're showing off about your American history,
really,
your American Constitution. We're on the Australian Constitution, James. Back to it.
I think it really reinforces the point that we picked up this lesson that it's a state's house, because in America, where we got the idea from,
That's right. It
it was
indeed.
state parliaments appointing the senators.
Indeed.
And we do see that a little bit here with casual vacancies, where the state parliament is the body that is authorised
True.
to appoint.
You can see the political scientist in James coming out here. That's great. That is exactly
Sorry for
right.
the little blurb of history there for people at home.
The other aspect of our constitutional structure that has a real impact is the section that I mentioned in our first episode, which is section 51. And that is a section which actually sets out in the Constitution the areas of regulation that the federal government, the Commonwealth government, has power to make laws over. And if something is not mentioned in that list under Section 51, then theoretically, and we'll come back to the practice, but theoretically the federal government doesn't have the power to make laws. And the idea was that the states would continue to make laws for their own jurisdiction. And the whole idea of a federal system is that you have different jurisdictions within the same territory having power to make laws over their respective territories. So we do have areas of laws that are made for the Commonwealth, but then each of the different states also is able to make laws. There are only a few things that are exclusive that only the federal government can make laws over. So a federal system, and those of us who obviously live in a federal system, which is all of us, means that there are different laws that apply to us at the same time, and that can make for well, I guess it gives lawyers a lot to do in terms of being able to advise people sometimes of which laws apply when. But it makes for a more complicated system for us as individuals, and really makes the point that constitutions really do impact on our lives, because sometimes we really have to untangle which laws apply to us.
And of course, those folks that live in those cross-border regions, Queanbeyan, Albury-Wodonga,
Yes,
Tweed
indeed.
Heads, I think get a better sense of that than perhaps others do, because they live kind of in the kind of liminal
Yes.
zone between borders, where they
Indeed.
get different taxes potentially.
Yes.
Different public holidays is obviously the really big one that most people kind of understand. You know,
Yeah.
if you live in Queanbeyan but work in Canberra, you get
Exactly.
Canberra Day off, but you don't
Yes.
necessarily get
Yes.
the benefits of that. But even things like, we saw during COVID, obviously, and we'll get back to this
Yes.
again more in detail, but states having the power to close borders, and some states having different rules around who can and can't come into their state. I remember, 2021, as then ACT resident, I was allowed to go to Victoria and to the NT.
Yes.
But if I lived in Queanbeyan, just across the border, or in Murrumbateman, or the town that I now live in, back, past Yass, I couldn't go into Victoria or the NT. You're restricted, because it was the state government that had the power to decide travel and healthcare restrictions.
So that's right. So it is complicated for all of us. And then in the territory, as we said earlier, there are differences that apply because the federal government continues to have power over the ACT and the Northern Territory, even with self-government, that there is this override power. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of our federal system, given there are two jurisdictions, is what do you do if there's a conflict between the two? What if they clash and you can't actually do both things at the same time? And there is a provision in the Constitution, Section 109, which says that when a law of a state is inconsistent with the law of the Commonwealth, the latter, being the Commonwealth, shall prevail, and the former shall, to the extent of the inconsistency, be invalid. So there are a lot of cases that go to the High Court when there is a potential clash, because if the state says no, you can still do these things, someone has to decide if there is in fact a clash, and so the High Court is called on often to determine whether in fact the Commonwealth overrides the states. And we've seen actually some of that historically in cases around the racial discrimination acts around the country. So again, linking back to the treatment of Indigenous Australians, there have been cases where those inconsistencies have been ruled on by the court on Indigenous matters.
The only examples I can think of, which is good you brought up the others, because the only ones I can think of relate to the territories,
Yes.
which is the ACT and same-sex marriage, and the NT and assisted dying.
Yes.
Obviously,
So that actually comes around from the section to do with the Commonwealth having the power over the territories, which is Section 122. And that override power in a way mirrors what the Commonwealth can do if there is an inconsistency between the states and the territories.
of course, it's a bit more generous to the Commonwealth's
Yes, power over the state. So it sort of errs on the side of a more uniform system than it does on the differences. But when you think about having a federal system, and I've thought about it also from the perspective of gender, you know, what does that have as an impact on the way, say, gender policy plays out? And I think it's really interesting that sometimes having differences around the country actually means that you can have what's called a more competitive approach to good policy. So, for instance, at the moment, the Victorian government has introduced a Gender Equity Act that has improved some of the expectations and standards on governments and around gender policy. Or historically, the Commonwealth during the Hawke period introduced the Affirmative Action Act and the Sex Discrimination Act. So sometimes by having the different jurisdictions, there's more variety from which good policy can then be developed. And if you have only one power, if you only have a central government system, then you're forever wedded in that notion that there can only be one area of policy development.
It also does mean, though, conversely, that you can have some bad policies really just stick in a jurisdiction. And obviously, as an Indigenous person, I think that's a real kind of lead into the 1967 referendum.
Yes.
And especially with the discussion with Queensland, and I shouldn't malign Queensland too much, even though I'm from south of Queensland. They have had some good competitive federalist ideas with regards to abortion rights and women's health care. They did lead the charge on some of those things. But in terms of Indigenous people in the mid-20th century, the laws that the then Bjelke-Petersen government had in place were, draconian comparative to the rest of the country. This idea that Queensland was a much harsher place to be as an Aboriginal person, much harsher place to live, to try and get work, to where you could and couldn't be, all of these things that existed under the Aboriginal Protection Act in Queensland, very kind of serious. And then you have other jurisdictions that comparatively, not objectively, every jurisdiction was quite bad on Indigenous policy at the time, but comparatively a lot better, much more freedom in terms of movement, work, employment, where you can and can't be, who you can and can't have relationships with. And so it leads into this discussion in 1967, because what that referendum did almost exclusively, it did one of two things. The first thing it did was allow it to be counted in the census for the purposes of parliamentary seat distribution, and a very kind of boring and kind of
reckoning of the numbers of people for the
boring sounding thing to be done. But the second thing it did was it gave the Commonwealth power to legislate over our affairs, because Indigenous affairs up until that point, it wasn't that the Commonwealth merely didn't have it written down that they couldn't. It was explicitly included that they couldn't.
Shall I read it out?
Yeah,
so that was Section 5126, which was one of the original sections. It said that the Commonwealth had the power to make laws for the people of any race other than the Aboriginal race in any state for whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws.
So it was deliberate exclusion from the Commonwealth's power to make laws.
Indeed.
Not merely kind of tacit exclusion, which we have seen in a lot of sections where the government doesn't have explicit power but has a kind of tacit, it could potentially get involved if it wished to, even though it's not necessarily enumerated.
We'll come back to how they do that.
We'll come back to that later. But we're explicitly excluded here. So the 1967 referendum it reverses that. It gives the Commonwealth power, and the goal of that is to create this kind of uniformity, as you talked about, this idea that Indigenous people shouldn't have our basic fundamental rights differ on geography.
That's right.
It shouldn't be the case that you can work in Yass, but you can't work in Goondiwindi, or that you can get married to a white person in Renmark, South Australia, but you can't in Mildura, Victoria. And again, I'm not sure if those examples are accurate, but I'm just highlighting there
how there are differences.
How the differences there really played out on, again, not kind of complex issues, not tax reform or the legalistic thing, but very kind of basic fundamental rights.
Yes.
And so that's the kind of thing about 67 that I think we get conflated in this idea that it was a vote for rights, which in a sense it was a vote for rights, but also wasn't. It was merely to kind of defederalize in a way.
Yes. The power of the states.
The power of the states, because you see this kind of competitive federalism work in the negative sense, where some state governments that were particularly cruel, Queensland being a kind of very vociferous example, WA as well, having really particularly egregious policy towards our people, sticks.
Yeah.
Even if the majority of people in the majority of states, and 90% of Australians voted in favour of the referendum, approved of a much more uniform approach.
And it's sort of interesting in terms of the power of the states at that time to discriminate against Indigenous Australians, because they're still in the Constitution, Section 25, which says for the purposes of the last section, which is electing people to the House of Representatives, it says if by the law of any state all persons of any race are disqualified from voting at elections for the more numerous houses of the Parliament of the state, then in reckoning the number of the people of the state or the Commonwealth, persons of that race resident in that state shall not be counted. So that is a remnant of that sort of law that the states continued to have and theoretically continue to have.
The states have the power to discriminate based on race with regards to voting, and the Commonwealth Constitution enables that to be continued into the Commonwealth level.
So each of these are examples of the sort of the balancing act between federal power over different areas and state power. And another aspect of interpretation when the court has used Section 109 to decide if there is a clash is that it introduced a notion that the Commonwealth had the power to what's called cover the field, and that is to make an explicit sort of expressed intention that when they were making laws in relation to a particular area, and one of those, for instance, is immigration and immigration restriction, that the intention was for it to cover the field, as in cover all of the country, and that the court has interpreted that as meaning that it overrides anything that the states does in that wants to do in that area. And that's been another means for the Commonwealth to exert more power over those specific heads of power that they actually have been given power over. So that over time has reduced the capacity of states to introduce laws if the Commonwealth passes a law which explicitly says its intention is to cover the field. So that's one way Commonwealth power has grown over that time. But the other is about constitutional interpretation.
Is the money, right? The other one's is the cash.
Yes, but beyond constitutional interpretation, exactly, is the cash. So Section 96 is a section which effectively has given the Commonwealth the power to direct or encourage very strongly the states in relation to financial assistance. So if the Commonwealth gives financial assistance to the states, it can often do that on the basis that it's directing the states as to how to use that in a legislative sense. Now, in order to unpack that a little bit more, how did the Commonwealth get the financial power to be able to exert more power over the states? Because originally, even though the Commonwealth had power under Section 51 over tax, for instance, it didn't stop the states from actually levying taxes as well. So one of the first things under Section 51 for the federal Parliament is to make laws to do with trade and commerce with other countries, so all that stuff that I was talking about, the competition at the beginning. But the section is taxation, but so as not to discriminate between states or parts of states. So you could have a universal tax system. Now, again, historically, what's interesting is during the Second World War, there was an agreement between the Commonwealth and the states that the Commonwealth would levy income tax. Now, there's nothing to this day that stops the state from also levying income tax, but who is going to introduce a policy where you're explicitly saying you're going to be taxing the same money that your income that's already been, taxed by the Commonwealth? And so the reality is that what's called a vertical fiscal imbalance, where the Commonwealth takes in much more money for areas where it doesn't necessarily have the power to regulate. It's grown over what it can regulate, but that's why it has had the power over time to have more control than the states by using that financial power in a way to influence the states. And we see the Council of Australian Government meetings and this new National Cabinet.
National Cabinet now, right? Yeah. And we also see it with regards to, GST was another example where that bargain kind of continues in the way that, the federal government levies the GST,
yes,
but doesn't actually keep any of it.
Correct.
It redistributes all of the GST via, and I speak from personal experience here, via a very complicated formula.
Yes.
Where they calculate based on different state factors as to how much per year every state gets back from the GST. And some states not states, but the NT gets back several dollars more than they give in GST. WA obviously recently got a very fair deal on the formula, and that's one of these things that keeps coming up.
Indeed.
With regards to federalism and this kind of vertical fiscal imbalance is the states are competing with each other for a pile of money that the Commonwealth is raising on their behalf. The
Indeed.
GST is raised by the Commonwealth for the states.
Yes.
And then the states have to fight it out as to who gets that money and in what proportions, because obviously you could just make the argument that, every dollar raised you get back, but that's not how that works. It's not how the Commonwealth wants it to work. The Commonwealth wants GST to be some kind of redistributive measure, where states that generate a lot of income redistribute to other states on a basis of equality. Tasmania can't generate a lot of revenue, nor can the NT. So when they generate a lot of revenue, they want that to go. NSW generates trillions of dollars in revenue, billions of dollars in revenue.
Yes. So
they want some of that money to go to other poorer states. Again, the equality of states is kind of supreme in the system, even when the Commonwealth is intervening.
Indeed. And I think it's sort of a reminder of the basic point that I'm wanting this whole series to remind people, that our Constitution has an impact on every aspect of our lives because of these different structural arrangements. And so structures are really important in thinking through how to modernise or make the Constitution more appropriate. And I think COVID, this might be the nice point to finish off this section, is that COVID really was an amplification of some of those aspects that really brought home to everybody the nature of our federal system. And it's in two ways that I think it would be helpful to flesh this out. One was about the international system and in terms of freedom of movement in and out of the country, and the Commonwealth having the power under Section 51 to quarantine and to create quarantine stations. That is one of Section 51, subsection 9, gives the Commonwealth that power. But we saw in that National Cabinet this decision by the government of the day to really give the states who had concurrent responsibility more responsibility for quarantining. And so that led to the scenario that we had with limited numbers of people coming into the country, and Australian citizens, when we come back to the session on citizenship in the Constitution, Australian citizens effectively being abandoned and not being able to get back into the country because there weren't enough quarantine spaces.
Or having to shell out several thousands of dollars
Indeed.
to get their place in a quarantine station.
Indeed,
And that's not even mentioning whether or not they can get on a Qantas flight or not, which is a separate problem.
So again, the structure of our Constitution had an impact, and could have had a more positive impact in the sense that the Commonwealth Government could have initiated, quick, ready-made quarantine stations all around the country so that Australians could have come back in a sort of health-safe manner. So that's one aspect our constitutional structure is interesting to look at. And the other, of course, is in relation to borders, as we were talking about earlier. So these borders became hard and fast borders, and that those of us who are used to having travelled around the country freely suddenly were subject to the power of each of the different states in terms of the closing of those borders.
Yeah, I think I have all of the apps on my phone, the COVID registration apps.
Yes.
The third way, though, that actually jumps out at me from the COVID era is hospital funding. The government of the day made a deal with the states to double the amount of hospital funding that states would get, because obviously states are responsible for hospitals and health.
That's right, because they're not under this Section 51 with the Commonwealth.
Doesn't have the Commonwealth power, but the government funds a lot of it through the taxation powers, again, through this kind of taxation bargain that we have from World War II. And the government doubled the amount of money that hospitals are getting. And then now they're looking to wind that back, and you see this kind of backlash from the states going, actually, no, please don't take that money away. We want some of this money back. At the Commonwealth, obviously, that cedes a lot of their power to the states, that they just keep giving the money. So there's obviously these conditions that get imposed as to what the money can go to and how they can spend the money, and the extra money has to go to X, Y, or Z.
Well, that's, I think, actually a really interesting point to finish off on in terms of how you balance federalism with other principles in our Constitution. So we're going to be spending another session looking at representative democracy. But to end off here, I'd say that perhaps the emphasis over time has been to prioritise federalism over representative democracy. And one example which links back to some of my interests in gender in the Constitution and the section that I've shared before, but for those just listening to this session alone, Section 41, which gives a reminder of the women of the 1890s who made sure that their vote was protected. That section says if you have a right to vote in a state, that you can't be precluded from voting in a federal election. Well, in 1983, when Malcolm Fraser decided to call an election, he shut the electoral rolls very quickly, within 24 hours. So it meant a lot of people who weren't on the roll were precluded from voting, people who had just become citizens, people who didn't have a fixed voter address, people who just turned 18. And so they were stopped. They would have been stopped from voting in a federal election. But someone in New South Wales said, well, what about this Section 41, which says if you have a right to vote in the state, you can't be precluded. And so those people who'd been locked off went to the New South Wales Electoral Commission and put their names on the electoral roll in New South Wales, and then said, well, we have to be put onto the federal election. And the Electoral Commission said, no, that doesn't apply in this context. So it went to the High Court, and the High Court looked very closely at it and looked at the history. They actually looked at Catherine Helen Spencer's advocacy and the women of that time, really advocating for the vote. And the High Court at the time interpreted it very narrowly. They said that those women were really only interested for themselves or for those people living at that time. And they said once the 1902 Commonwealth Electoral Act came into force, that section sort of became redundant, and it was no longer a living section. And part of their reasoning was that federalism and a federal system overrode representative democracy. And what they meant by that is if each of the states could continue to have an influence, you'd be in a situation where some states might give more people the right to vote, like a state might introduce for 16-year-olds and another state doesn't. And they said that wouldn't lead to a very uniform system. So they gave federalism almost the role of trumping representative democracy. And to this day, that's something I think is perhaps a too narrow an interpretation, and we can come back to that for representative democracy.
The power of the states.
The power of
Sadly,
the states.
not the power of New South Wales to win in the football, but the power of the states.
Indeed. So at that note, I think we will finish this podcast on federalism and the Australian Constitution. This podcast was proudly produced at the University of Canberra on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. Special thanks to Rach White for her production. If you would like to find out more about the topics discussed in this episode, the Australian Constitution and the referendum on the voice to Parliament, please refer to the show notes for some useful links. The theme music for this podcast series is How to Vote by Patrick Hazler.